Enjoy a balanced view on politics, business, arts, even property. If gold wallpaper's not your thing, try The Week with 6 issues free, then auto-renews from $38.99 a quarter. Cancel anytime. Search The Week free.
Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
The time is now 6:17. Now, there's always a lot of reaction to budgets, even so-called mini ones. But one response, which was almost immediate today, was a massive drop in the pound. This evening, sterling was below $1.10, the lowest for 37 years. What does that mean in real terms? Dr. Linda Yu is an Oxford economist and author of The Great Economists. I'm also joined by Peter McNamara, former Group Managing Director of Alliance at Leicester, now Chairman of H&T. Welcome to you both. Linda, can I just start with you? Very straightforward, simple question. Why is the pound falling right now?
2 reasons. Worried about growth prospects for the UK and a strong dollar. So the way that sterling is typically measured is against one currency. So the dollar has strengthened a great deal, which means that sterling fell. But today, the falls were because of the mini budget and concerns about borrowing and whether it'll generate growth or not.
So brokers and their colleagues, they're looking at the budget and they're asking themselves, is there a credible strategy for getting the money back again? Is that basically it?
Yes, I think they're looking at it and thinking, okay, you've presented a budget. We've been worried about growth for some time. Sterling, remember, has fallen before this 15% against the dollar since the start of the year. It's also been down against the euro. I should also say euro has actually fallen today against the dollar. So always think of it as pairs. Yes, but even on a trade-weighted basis, in other words, if you take sterling against all its trading partners, what the currency is reflecting is uncertainty. And because we've had a lot of uncertainty with COVID and now with the new growth strategy, and we had uncertainty after Brexit, the fall in investment, the need to raise growth is understood, but I think sterling reacts to whether or not they think the prospects are clearly set out, and I think that's partly why sterling has fallen in reaction to
Is it unfair or too brutal to say they don't buy the quasi-quating strategy?
There's a lot in that strategy which is yet to be fleshed out. For instance, what happens to debt over the longer term? We're told that we will find out in due course. So yes, sterling does react to certainty and uncertainty. What's underlying it over the longer term are things like, the interest rate, the differential between what our rates will be, what the US will be, all of that. But on the day, it tends to be, I think, reaction to, is it clear? Will it generate growth? Do we have enough information?
Peter, can I turn to you? I mean, the pound has had another rotten day, down 3%, I think, against the dollar. And we've seen a spike in bond yields, which means that government borrowing is going to go up. Are we seeing early signs that whatever the political reaction in the House of Commons, the markets don't like what they heard today?
I think partly the UK has been behind the curve on interest rates. And again, with the announcement a couple of days ago, we were behind by 0.25% on the US rate change. So there's a bit of reaction inevitably on that. I think that's the concern. In the meantime, what we've seen with the government's moves today is an attempt really to do...
In 300 yards, keep right to continue towards Tons Lane A355.
...to spend money and push that economy and that growth as far as they can. So a series of measures, many of which would appear on the face of it to be pretty unpopular. So, for example, there's the removal of the cap on bonuses, which is attracting for bankers, which is
keep right,
or is bound to attract a lot of negative criticism. But the point here is that if they can make the UK more attractive for financial institutions, and those bankers spend the cash in the UK, pay some tax in the UK, and you get more institutions based here and operating here, all of that helps the economy considerably. At a further level...
Sorry to just jump in on that basic point, which is that you've got a big tax cut for people who are at the top of the tree, and it's argued that they spend more of their money outside the UK. If you raised incomes and raised pay for people who are towards the bottom of the heap, the nurses and care workers and people, they spend their money in their local communities, and therefore it's better for growth and it's less inflationary.
Yeah, there's some truth in that, but it's quite hard to do, really, because there's going to be a lot of inflationary pressure that the government is unable to address for many of the, frankly, less well-off people in the UK. Now,
In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the first exit onto the M4 slip road to London Heathrow Airport.
Because you've had a huge growth in the number of people that pay higher rates of tax. People paying higher rates of tax has more than tripled since 1990. So you've had a big increase there. If you can reduce the tax burden there, it puts quite a lot of cash into the economies that will, to some extent, mitigate the effects of inflation by reducing the wage pressure on those individuals that would push forward more inflation. So you can see why they're doing that at a sort of fundamental economic level. It makes some sense. And of course, there's an overall reduction, albeit 1%, on the lower rate of tax. And you've got the changes in national insurance, which again...
In a quarter of a mile, merge onto M4.
They're putting more money into the economy, which is the right thing to do.
That's the only card they've got to play, frankly. That's the hard point.
Let me turn back to Linda on that, because it seems to be one of the problems they have there is they put more money into the economy. The Bank of England looks at this as we're worried even more about inflation. They jack up interest rates, which takes the money back out again. So it's almost you've got a push me, pull you tussle going on between the Treasury and the Bank of England.
Yes.
Yes.
I think the energy tab. Well, one of the things that the Chancellor pointed out.
Continue on M4 for 9 miles.
Wholesale cost of energy that will reduce inflation by 5 percentage points.
Yes.
So if inflation, therefore, doesn't peak at mid-teens and it can come down to double digits or below, it takes a little pressure off the Bank of England. The Bank of England is still searching for what's called a neutral rate, the rate at which they neither stimulate nor depress, because they raise too much, it hits you're pushing the economy to a recession. That's what happened in the early 1980s after the 1970s.
It's a very delicate balance, Linda.
Yes.
But there's a very interesting piece in the Financial Times written by somebody called Linda Yu, which I'm using here, in which I learned the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey stresses that 80% or so of inflation is due to global factors, which is why I want to come back to the weakening of the pound today, 3% down against the dollar. A lot of people at home will say, well, I'm not going to go to Florida on my holiday, I'm not going to go to New York anytime soon, this doesn't really affect me. Why are they wrong?
I don't think they're wrong in recognizing that staycations might be slightly more affordable when you have a...
Well, there is that. Yeah.
So I think what a weak currency does is it actually makes imported goods more expensive because you buy less with sterling and for things that are priced in dollars. So one of the reasons...
Crude oil and things like that.
Yes, and
more expensive.
Exactly.
You get more inflation.
Exactly, and so because we import a great deal of our manufactured goods and various things, this is one of the reasons why we have higher inflation, because we're a more open economy than other countries in the G7. So sterling does have that impact. The positive side of a weak currency for businesses is that it should price exports more competitively. I say that with a lot of hesitation because the trade deficit, what we sell versus what we buy, that's also at a record high. So even though sterling's been weak, it hasn't really made a difference. So if sterling were to, if the growth that's, a lot of the measures today were actually around investment. That's actually key to raising growth because we invest less than most major economies, 10% of GDP. If those investment measures can raise growth, then that will strengthen sterling over the longer term. And then that is the kind of virtuous growth cycle that would help control inflation as well. But there's a big lag between putting in measures to stimulate investment.
And that, Peter, is where we all hope to get to, that virtuous circle. But
yes, and I think
I don't want to be too sort of scary about this, but if the pound, for instance, fell to parity against the dollar, if this carried on, would that be the kind of crisis that would force the Treasury to rethink, force them to look at what they've done?
Well, I mean, they've got a number of angles. Clearly, they're going to come under big pressure to more aggressively increase the interest rates because, in effect, they've got to try and dampen down some degree of inflation that's happening, and that's the only tool they've got to do some of that. In practice, the government also has almost a bigger card to play, which is the amount that it can suppress wage inflation. which is going to be the other big problem that's going to create more pressure. And the big fear that's covering everybody, or covering the government as well as the Bank of England, is this fear that you have very low levels of growth and very high levels of inflation, the so-called stagflation.
Stagflation, there we are.
And
That's the threat.
That's the problem that they're trying to avoid. So can they push enough growth to get out of that cycle? And the only way that they've got to do that is to, in effect, lower the taxes where it's going to have the most impact to drive growth and behaviour that encourages growth.
Peter McNamara and Linda Yu, thank you both very much. These are complicated and difficult choices, and let no one say they're not. But they're also political choices. And I'm joined now by Ben Kentish, our Westminster editor. Ben, I'm really interested in what you're picking up behind the scenes, because I've been hanging around talking to Tory MPs. Now, of course, a lot of the ones with time to hang around are the ones who, by definition, aren't in government, very often the ones who backed Rishi Sunak, one of the other candidates, and have been frozen out by this trust. So they are inevitably somewhat disillusioned. And yet, there is a real sense that I'm picking up of unease on the Tory backbenches for what they've heard from Kwasi Kwarteng today.
Andrew, if anybody thought having a new leader was going to bring the Tory party back together, I'm not sure I did think that, but if they did, they are wrong. Tonight deeply divided this party between those who actually are very happy with what Liz Truss has announced, and there are quite a lot of those. They see it as a return.
We've got a real conservative
exactly,
party.
True conservatism, real conservative economic values, and those that are pretty concerned about it. Now, there are some that I've spoken to who love the economics, who think exactly what they want, but are worried about the politics, because they say, look, while we agree effectively this is what the country needs economically, going back to our constituencies as they're doing tonight and trying to explain to their voters why, at a time of crisis for so many people, the government is prioritising lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, reducing tax rates for the richest 1% of earners, and so on. Politically, it's a tough sell. But what a few people I've spoken to have said, look, time will tell. It's a huge gamble, nobody doubts that. But what they say is we're on course for recession as things stand. The government needed to do something. It needed to do something radical.
This is something, so let's do it.
And that's what they've done.
Let's do it. I was very struck, Rachel Reeves, now this may be political game playing or whatever, but she clearly thinks at some level that it might be difficult for the government to get the 45p rate change through, and that Conservative MPs will not vote for it. What's your impression?
No, I think they will get it through. There will be a rebellion. You read out the tweet by Julian Smith and others who may well not back it because they think it's wrong, or they think it's not in their interest politically, particularly some of those in marginal seats, to support it. I think it will get through, Andrew, but I think what you're also going to see is questions raised by the opposition parties about the mandate that the government has to do this, because of course in 2019 the Conservatives were acting on a manifesto of ultimately high spending, high taxation, big government investment in under-invested areas of the country, and they are switching completely to a very different approach. I think what you're going to hear from Keir Starmer and others is, what mandate have you got to do this?
Absolutely. Nobody was elected, well, nobody elected this government to do this bigger change. In other words, when Boris Johnson fell in that dramatic way, if he had been replaced by somebody who was not Boris Johnson but was basically pursuing Boris Johnson's policies, as for instance on levelling up, then there might have been no problem. Because this election for the Conservative leader has produced a radical change of direction, and this is certainly that, there is going to be a question about its democratic legitimacy.
Yes, I think there would be that question if it was simply a new leader, as you say, Andrew. It's hard to overstate the pivot. It's a complete U-turn in terms of the very fundamentals of what the government believes in and what it's trying to do. No government in you might say decades has taken such a radical economic approach of this nature as Liz Truss is doing, and it's markedly different, markedly to what Boris Johnson was trying to do, and that will raise questions about democratic mandates and legitimacy to do that.
And big questions they are, Ben. Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, earlier today, a Conservative peer and former Tory minister tweeted this.
In 2 miles at junction 3, take the A312 exit to Harrow, Hayes.
It's left me. As a result, I find myself increasingly homeless, and from the messages I get and the conversations I have, I think I'm far from being alone. He's going to be joining me after the news, but before that, here's Tim Humphrey with your headlines. It's 6:31.
The biggest tax cuts in half a century have been announced by the Chancellor, but some experts are calling his mini-budget a gamble. The highest earners will do best, with the top rate being scrapped, while the basic rate is being cut by 1 penny from April. That's a year earlier than planned. The Chancellor's hoping his policies will stimulate growth in the economy for everyone. It's thought the measures will cost £45 billion a year. Labour says the proposals show the Tories are admitting to 12 years of economic failure. The pound fell to a 37-year low as the financial plan was set out. And the weather, showers continuing in the southeast tonight, clear spells elsewhere, chilly in the north with a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC.
Want to know what it feels like to win a multi-million-pound house? Well, visit omaze.co.uk by midnight this Sunday, and next week I could be knocking on your door. Because one person is guaranteed to win our fully furnished house on the Kent coast, worth £2.5 million. Last month, we changed the lives of Utam Palmer and his family.
Everything is beautiful.
This is what dreams are made of.
We're really set for life.
You could be next. And the best part? You'll be supporting Global's Make Some Noise. For your chance to win a spectacular beachfront house in Kent, worth £2.5 million. You must enter by midnight this Sunday.
In a quarter of a mile, at junction 3, take the A312 exit to Harrow, Hayes.
That's omaze.co.uk. Over 18s only, no purchase necessary. Conditions apply.
Many people struggle with loose and missing teeth. Often their dentist has told them nothing can be done. Let the TDC team restore your teeth, your smile, and
Exit at junction 3.
award-winning Smile in a Day dental implant treatment. Book your consultation today. Visit smileinaday.co.uk.
In a quarter of a mile, at Cranford Parkway interchange, take the 4th exit onto the Parkway A312.
On the robin hiding in that holly bush. Amazing. See the world at its most beautiful with the incredible new iPhone 14 Pro. Get it from Vodafone today with the UK's only phone buyback guarantee. And get a guaranteed buyback price when you trade it in.
Selected devices only. Trading in good condition from September to October 2023 via our trading tool. Airtime and device eligibility checks and terms apply. See vodafone.co.uk/buyback. Credit by Vodafone.
Want to work in the media? Kickstart your career with Global Academy. Apply now for year 10 or 12 at this unique media school. Search Global Academy.
This is LBC Tonight with Andrew Marr.
It's 6:34. I started today's show by saying that in sheer money terms, today's fiscal event was the biggest news in my lifetime. Now, the key thing that Kwesi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are after is, of course, growth. We haven't heard very much from Parliament so far. It's 6:30 already. Let's listen to a little of what the Chancellor's vision actually is as he outlined it in the Commons.
Our plan, Mr. Speaker, is to expand the supply side of the economy through tax incentives and reform. That is how we will deliver higher wages, greater opportunities, and crucially, Mr. Speaker, fund public services now and into the future. That is how we will compete successfully with dynamic economies around the world. And that is how, Mr. Speaker, we will turn this vicious cycle of stagnation into a virtuous cycle of growth.
Now, very, very revealing words there at the end. You heard this vicious cycle of stagnation. He appeared to be talking about the last 12 years. Vicious cycle of stagnation was pretty harsh on the governments that he was part of and the colleagues that he was working alongside in that period. But there's another really, really interesting, very, very brief clip I want you to listen to. Here it goes.
Mr. Speaker, we are at the beginning of a new era. And as we contemplate...
Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway.
New era, he was saying as they were the hubbub and the heckling.
Continue on the Parkway for 1 mile.
It is a new era. The slight problem is that we haven't voted for this new era, as we were saying before. And this new era is concerning quite a lot of traditional Conservatives. One of them is Lord Gavin Barwell, beg his pardon. He was a Conservative peer and a former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May. Gavin, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. You have tweeted today that the Conservative Party is leaving you. What do you mean by that? What provoked that?
It's not just today. I think it's a drift that's been taking place really over the last few years about respect for the rule of law, about the damage that's been done to trading relations with our nearest neighbours. But in terms of today's news and what you're focused on, look, let me start with where I agree. That first clip you played, I think the Chancellor is actually right to say that really since 2008, we've had a problem with the underlying growth rate of our economy. So he's focusing on the right problem. I have two problems with the solution he's come to. One is a moral problem, that to cut taxes for the wealthiest people in our country, and I'm one of the people that's going to benefit from the tax changes he announced today, and I agree that in the abstract, getting marginal rates of tax down is a good thing, but I don't need that money. And there are thousands and thousands of your listeners who do. And so to see a tax package that is so slanted in favour of the wealthiest people in the country, I think is unconscionable. And my second concern is that to fund those tax cuts through more borrowing, when we're already very heavily in debt interest payments are at a record level, is reckless, and it's not fiscally conservative to do that. So, if you're looking at today's news...
In a quarter of a mile, at Wagoners Roundabout, take the second exit and stay on the Parkway, A312.
On the same subject, I've been talking to Tory MPs, of course, today as well. I was talking to one minister, in fact, who said that they hadn't gone into the chamber of the House of Commons because they weren't sure that their face would be showing the right appropriate smile at the right moments when the Chancellor was talking, and made what I thought was a very, very interesting point, arguing that actually there is a philosophical problem for the Conservatives. When it comes to growth and economic policy, we've gone from David Cameron's sharing the proceeds of growth, and then a tougher stance with George Osborne and fiscal responsibility and austerity, and then we had your period with Theresa May, and we had the slight May...
Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway. In a quarter of a mile, continue straight onto Causeway, A312.
Boosterism and high public spending, and now we have this, and that's 5 different policies under one party, the Conservative Party, and there is a problem of intellectual coherence, this person was suggesting to me, and I put that to you too.
I think that's a fair critique. I mean, I think if you look at that progression that you've described, the first shift was to a degree forced by events. When Cameron was talking about sharing the proceeds of the growth, that was in the sort of late 2000s when the economy was growing strongly and austerity was a response.
Continue straight onto Causeway, A312.
Financial crisis. I think that the May government's approach, the industrial strategy, was a sort of evolution to deal with, an attempt to deal with this problem of the underlying growth rate. I completely agree with what you were just saying, that this approach we've had today is a total departure from the Johnson government's approach. I would argue, actually, Andrew, it's probably a bigger shift in economic policy than if you'd had Keir Starmer brought into number 10, compared with where Boris Johnson was. Yeah. So, it speaks to how the Conservative Party is struggling to work out whether it's based around its old coalition of the kind of 1980s and 1990s and a kind of return to that agenda, or the sort of new coalition that Boris Johnson put together in 2019.